Hey, fellow superhero cinephiles. Did you know that almost 30% of adults say they haven't read a book in the past year? The primary reason why is a lack of time. Well, Audible's here to help with the gift of found time. Thanks to Audible, you can listen to audiobooks like Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, or Slugfest, inside the epic 50-year battle between Marvel and DC. Read up on the history of superheroes in comics and movies with Grant Morrison's Super Gods. You can also check out Vanguard, my original superhero novel series, or try The Vril Agenda or The Adventures of Fortune McCall, both of which were written by our dearly departed host emeritus, Derek Ferguson. Whatever you're looking for, Audible has thousands of titles that you can consume while commuting, exercising, cooking, or just relaxing at home. And not only audiobooks, an Audible membership also gives you access to tons of content like podcasts, theatrical performances, and exclusive Audible originals that you won't find anywhere else. To give you a taste of what you can get, Audible has partnered with this show to provide listeners with a free 30-day trial. All you have to do is go to audibletrial.com/supercinemapod, and with your free trial, you get one free audiobook and two free Audible originals. In fact, you get to keep those titles even if you cancel before the trial is over. So what are you waiting for? Head on over to audibletrial.com/supercinemapod and start your free trial today.
It all began 400 years ago, when a small boy saw his father savagely murdered by pirates of the Singh Brotherhood. That same boy swore an oath of vengeance to fight piracy, greed, and cruelty in all its forms. And he became the first Phantom. I'm his descendant, Diana, sworn to carry out his oath. The mantle of the Phantom was passed down from father to son. 20 Phantoms came before me. No one knew that. They all thought it was the same Phantom. They all thought he was immortal. That's why they called him the Ghost Who Walks. No, I'm not immortal, Diana. I was born right here in this cave and educated in America. When my father was killed, I came back to take his place.
And one day your own son will take your place.
Yes.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine. And so for fans of superheroes, fans of comic books, they probably most know, some may not, that there was a kind of a predecessor to Superman and Batman and all that. And those were the pulp heroes. These were guys like Doc Savage and the Shadow, and they were mostly in pulp magazines in prose format, and then they eventually served as a stepping stone to the superheroes. In fact, many elements of Doc Savage can be found in Superman, many elements of the Shadow can be found in Batman, and so on. And that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about one of these heroes that have been translated into live action movies, and we're doing that with today's guest, who is a pulp author himself, and that's John Bruening. John, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good.
Great.
So welcome to the show. Before we get started talking about today's movie, why don't you tell the people a little bit about yourself?
Sure. As you said, the name is John Bruening. I'm many things, actually. I am the author of the multi-part Midnight Guardian series, which is published by Flinch Books, which is a small press imprint that was launched about 6 years ago, 2015, by Jim Beard, also a writer-editor in the Ohio area, in the Toledo area, and myself. And we publish our own stuff, our own novels, our own characters, as well as we also develop anthologies where we invite numerous writers to gather around a specific topic or genre and just have at it and do what they do best. Mm-hmm. So that is sort of the short version. I've been a professional writer for about 36 years. Started out as a journalist in the mid 1980s. I transitioned into marketing in the early 2000s. So I've been I've been a scribe of one kind or another for more than 3 decades. So I've been
Okay.
doing this for a while. Yes.
Yeah, almost my entire life, actually.
Don't say that.
Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about the pulp heroes, and well, let's talk about superheroes in general. Were you a fan of superheroes
Oh
growing
my
up?
gosh. Yeah, I think I learned to read somewhere around the age of 5, and about 20 minutes later, I was reading comic books. So, and I think the gateway drug for me was actually Saturday morning cartoons.
Hmm.
But once the reading started, I did about maybe 20 minutes of Dick and Jane, and then I went right to Superman. Um, and I probably spent the first 20 to 25 years of my life immersed in comics. It got to be kind of an expensive hobby by the time I was coming out of college, so I just sort of transitioned out of that and got more into prose reading. But I've been reading everything for like the vast majority of my life. But yeah, there were certainly a lot of comics in the first 20 to 25 years.
So you
So I
say
was pretty,
that
I was pretty well immersed. Yeah.
Saturday morning cartoons is your gateway drug. Any show in particular that was the one that kind of got you hooked?
I would have to say, now you got to remember I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. So it was probably the what was then called the New Adventures of Superman. It was produced by Filmation Studios, which was probably their first big name title to come out of that shop.
Mhm.
I think that series started somewhere around 66 or 67. It was voiced by Bud Collyer, who had done the voice of Superman in the 1940s on the radio,
Okay.
as well as the Fleischer comic, the Fleischer animated shorts during the 1940s.
Mhm.
The guy had an amazing voice, and when you're 5 years old and you hear that deep resonant voice coming out of your TV, you're just hooked. And like I
Right.
said, I come from Cleveland, so that's the birthplace of Superman. So it's sort of like if you're from here, it's kind of Superman is kind of in your DNA,
Right.
whether you're a fan or not.
Mhm. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny. A lot of us, I think, seem to get into comics through that route. For me, it was,
Yes.
it was in the '90s. It was Batman the Animated Series and X-Men that got me into it.
Sure.
And now people are getting in through the movies and all sorts of stuff like that. So
Sure. Sure.
so it's always cool to see to learn how people have kind of found their way into this little niche of ours.
hmm
Now, what about the pulp stuff? Because you're a fan of the pulp stuff as well, correct?
Yeah, that came along later.
Mhm.
And it's hard to know exactly where and when that happened. It was sort of a confluence of events, or a confluence of circumstances. Certainly my dad, he was a big fan of the pulps
Mhm.
back in the original pulp era of the 30s and 40s. He read Doc Savage, he read The
Mhm.
Shadow. Um, he read a lot of comics in the early days. I think he was reading Captain America. He was spending a lot of time at the local movie house on Saturdays, watching westerns, watching cliffhanger serials. So which is all kind of the same vibe that makes up the pulps. So
Right.
I guess I would have to say I started dialing into the pulps probably later than a lot of folks do. I think I started reading Edgar Rice Burroughs' Mars stories somewhere around I want to say the 1990s. So I'm like
Mhm.
at that point I'm in my late 20s or thereabouts, and I'm really starting to dial into Edgar Rice Burroughs in particular and the pulps in general.
Mhm. Okay. And were any of those that particularly stood out for you that were kind of like your go-tos?
Well, like I say, it started with the Burroughs, the Mars series, and then I started, I started wondering who the heck is this Doc Savage guy,
Mhm.
and I was starting to dig around some local bookstores and not having much luck because when, people who collect the Bantam paperbacks, they don't let go of those. But
Right.
and then I worked on a street where there was this really great little bookshop, and the woman, the proprietor there, and she's still the proprietor there, like 30 years later. She said she called me at my office one day and she said, "You were looking for Doc Savage, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Some guy just brought in about 60 Bantam paperbacks. Do you
Oh,
want them? Do you want me to
wow.
hold them aside?" I said, "Hell yes." And I was there the next day. And because I was such a frequent customer, she gave me a really sweet deal. And I brought these things home for like 30 or 40 bucks. And there were like 60 different titles. And they're still here in my office. And I have yet to make it's been more than 20 years since I bought those from her. I've yet to make my way all the way through all of them. Um, but they were sort of the beginning of a lot of pulp collecting, of a lot of different titles, a lot of different characters, a lot of different genres.
Yeah, I found that since because I didn't really know much about the pulps except for little things here and there, like stuff that was in movies or TV. But I didn't really read any of the original stuff until probably about the same time, probably about like my mid late 20s.
Okay, sure.
I reading some of those stuff, they can be a tough read in a
Yes.
modern context. So
Yes,
the
they can.
characters are but the characters are really fascinating. I've always found.
Yes, they make even when the reading is sometimes tough going, the characters as concepts, I think, are fascinating.
Yeah,
they're just,
absolutely.
Even if the prose is clunky sometimes, just the concept of this character and what this character is all about and how they came to be and why they do what they do, that's always kind of a fascinating concept, I think.
Yeah, and the Popes have had a really interesting track record because there have been these different periods of revival for different pulp characters. So that most of them started out in the 30s during the Great Depression, and then when they started, I think it was the 70s was probably like the next big boom of them, when you had like all these paperback publishers putting out these collections. There were like
Actually,
a lot of
actually the Bantam paperback started coming out in the 60s. I think it was 66 when they first started reprinting the Doc Savage pulps from 30 years prior. But I think that whole series started around 66, and it went as far as I want to say about 81 or 82.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was actually a little earlier than what you're saying. But yeah. You're in the right ballpark.
And also, like I think it was maybe the 70s or the 80s, they had started, a bunch of comic publishers had also started putting out stuff. Like there was Denny O'Neill's the Shadow series, was probably the most famous of those, the most successful. But then also there was like their Doc Savage comics, I remember seeing too, and the Avenger as well, I think. And then in the 90s, there was this really interesting period where, so this was, superhero movies hadn't really quite hit it big yet. I mean, you had those standouts like Superman the movie and Batman, but superhero movies in general, they hadn't really quite, hit the kind of zeitgeist that they would later, either in the early 2000s or later with the revival with Iron Man and The Dark Knight. But in the 90s, you had this interesting thing where there was a lot of pulp stuff that was being optioned and being made into movies, and the obviously, Indiana Jones was clearly inspired by the pulps and all that. But as for direct adaptations, there were three big ones in the 90s. There was The Rocketeer in 91, and then The Shadow, I believe, was in 1994, and then today's movie, what we're talking about today, The Phantom, in 1996. And
but the thing to remember though is that the Phantom did not start out in the pulps. He started out as just to clarify that he started out as a newspaper adventure strip, by Lee Falk.
Yeah, you're actually one step ahead of me on that. I was just
sorry.
That's okay.
I'm jumping the gun.
But yeah, the Phantom is this interesting bridge character between the pulps and superheroes, because he was like the very first character to actually have. I mean, you could argue that the pulp heroes wore costumes of a sort, but mostly it was just like suits with masks and that kind of stuff. The Phantom was the first one who actually had like this colorful spandex costume, which was later became the template for Superman and Batman and all the other superheroes.
With the striped trunks.
With the striped trunks, which they left out of this movie, thankfully.
Wisely so, I think. But...
Yeah, I agree. So I'm not sure if you know anything about that, but what do you think, if you have any information about that, just being a bigger fan of the pulps than I am, about why that there was kind of like this pulp revival in movies and TV in the 90s? Because beyond those three movies, you also had some stuff going on TV. You had stuff like the Tia Carrere Relic Hunter TV series, was I think in the late 90s. You also had Sam Raimi's Darkman, which was much more pulpish than it is superhero, I think. And also Sam Raimi's original Mantis pilot, which was much more pulp infused than the TV show that followed.
I think you kind of hit it on the head a minute ago when you mentioned Indiana Jones. I think let's see, that franchise, the first movie was in 81, I believe. And I think that really, I mean, and granted, you had a couple guys at the helm of that who were just just blue chippers. I mean, you know, these are A-list, you know, Spielberg and George Lucas. I mean, you really can't go wrong with that kind of a team. And they really tapped into not just the pulp sensibility. They certainly did that, but I think also, and something I mentioned a minute ago, the cliffhanger serial. I think, and they said as much. I think either Spielberg or Lucas or both of them said we were going for that classic 1930s, 1940s cliffhanger serial where like every 15 or 20 minutes the hero gets himself into a serious jam and it looks pretty hopeless, but somehow he pulls it out.
Yeah, actually, you could actually watch it with a stopwatch, and you can track it, and it works out pretty well.
Yes. So I think the success of that franchise, pretty much from 81 until I think the third movie was in 89. I could be getting my dates wrong, and I apologize for not having that at my fingertips. But I think the third movie, which by
89,
many
you're right, yeah.
Many consider to be the best. You know, Sean Connery with what was it called? Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, those were so successful that I think a lot of producers and directors said, okay, let's do, because let's face it, that's how Hollywood works. Figure out what's working and just do more of that.
Right.
And I think a lot of producers were looking at that franchise saying, okay, you know, that's working. That period, 1930s, Depression / World War II. That's the period that's sort of the sweet spot as far as the, you know, the historical setting for adventure stories like this.
Yeah.
And now, granted, we're talking about movies. We're talking movies now that are now going into the 90s. But I think there was still enough of that residual success of that franchise in the 80s, and certainly the Batman movie in '89. It was sort of timeless. You watch that thing for 2 hours and you can't tell what period of time that movie takes place in. And I think, you know, I think it was the same thing, that it was sort of like kind of banking on this sort of retro sensibility to these stories, because for whatever reason that's what people were. I think you saw more of that in the 90s when you started getting into movies like you just mentioned, The Rocketeer, The Shadow, The Phantom, and probably one or two others I'm not thinking of, but yeah, that was the big trifecta of the 90s, I think.
Yeah, and probably also adding to the idea of looking to the pulps would have been Conan the Barbarian, because that was in '82.
Yes. Sure.
So I think that would probably also have had some influence on that. So yeah, that makes sense too. And also, you know, if you're trying to do something superhero-esque, you're trying to have your own Batman, it makes sense to go with these more grounded characters like the Shadow or the Rocketeer or the Phantom, because they're so much cheaper to do than trying to adapt something that's much bigger, that requires more special effects.
Right. I think I think each of those three movies did an admirable job. With the technology did not exist yet, whereby you could make a movie like what we've seen come out of Marvel Studios in the last 10 or 12 years.
Right.
But certainly, you know, given the tools that were available at that time, the filmmaking tools, all three of those movies, even if they didn't necessarily do well at the box office or with the critics, just visually, I think they did a respectable job of telling the story they wanted to tell, with the effects to make it believable.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think of those, if you're kind of ranking those three, I think I would probably put the Rocketeer at the top of the pile, and I'd put the Shadow at the bottom, and then in the middle, like right in the middle, I'd have the Phantom. Is how
I think I agree. I think I agree. Certainly, the Rocketeer has pardon the bad choice of words, has legs all its own. I mean, it just. I mean, that thing. I mean, it kind of came and went in the theaters after I don't know exactly how long it ran in the theaters, but my gosh, I mean, that thing has certainly has developed a cult following over the last 30 years.
Yeah. I mean, so much so that Disney Plus is even doing. I think they're doing a new animated series about the Rocketeer as well.
I believe so. Yeah.
And that movie has got a real timeless quality. I think it has a lot to do with. Joe Johnston directed that, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes, he did.
And he definitely is someone who has that kind of pulp sensibility. He had worked on the Indiana Jones movies as well, and then he brought a lot of that kind of sensibility when he did Captain America: The First Avenger as well.
It's funny you say that, and I don't want to digress too much, and I'm sure you don't either. But when I watched, and I gotta say, Captain America: The First Avenger is probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite movie out of the Marvel, the whole Marvel Studios, that whole franchise. when I watched that movie, I thought, you know what? A lot of this movie is a nod to the Rocketeer, and
Yeah.
it almost felt like the Rocketeer was like Joe Johnston's warm up for the big night, which was
Oh.
Captain America: the first Avenger.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It just there are subtle, small, but unmistakable callbacks to the Rocketeer
Mhm.
in Captain America: First Avenger, and I think in a lot of respects, in almost a sentimental way, they're kind of connected to each other,
Mhm.
and by design, I think by Johnston's design, I think.
Yeah, and Lee Falk. So with the Phantom,
Yes.
Lee Falk had started this in 1936,
Correct.
and he had done it. It looks, if I'm reading this correctly, had done it pretty much continuously up until his death, and he died in when was it? It passed away. It was
I
not
think it
that
was
long.
I think it was the 90s. I think I'm not sure about that. But he lived a good long life, and he spent a lot of it doing the Phantom.
Yeah, and almost entirely by him. Yeah, that's which is, you want to talk about a long run on a comic. That's
Yeah,
you know,
yeah. I mean, he had a lot of different artists working for him. I mean, he was the sole credit on the strip, but I don't know. I mean, there were many artists who have worked on the Phantom along the way.
1999. So you're right, late 90s.
All right. Okay.
And yeah, I mean, you talk about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby on Fantastic Four, or Chris Claremont on X-Men, or Peter David on Hulk, and you look at Lee Falk on the Phantom. Like that's probably the record. I don't think anyone has come close to will ever come close to beating that record.
36 to 99. That's 60 some years, and that's that's. I don't know where you get the stamina to stay with one character for that long.
Yeah, I mean, I've got trouble going past 6 books, so I don't.
yeah.
So, were you a fan of the Phantom comics?
I knew of the Phantom, certainly. And I had a small handful of Charlton comics when Charlton had the licensing rights to publish Phantom comics, and incredible artist named Don Newton. And I regret to this day that for whatever reason I sold them or traded them for something. I don't know what, but I don't have them anymore, and I kick myself to this day. But I can't say I was like knee deep, a knee deep fan or neck deep fan in the Phantom, but I certainly knew of him. I had followed him a little bit in one of the local newspapers that carried him for a while. I knew the general story. I can't say I was like, a hardcore. I knew the backstory, and I knew all the minutia about the Phantom legend, but I certainly was aware of him, as a viable and long running hero in both newspapers and comic books.
Yeah, I had known nothing about him. For me, it was with all these pulp heroes. It was always the superhero trappings that got me interested in them in the first place.
Sure.
And one of the things I liked about the Phantom, which I think was a failure of the Shadow and the Rocketeer, is they're not shy about showing him in costume. Right? He spends a lot. I was watching this movie last night, and I was surprised at how much time Billy Zane actually spends in the suit, because that was not common at that time.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. I think. I think I remember my initial takeaway the first time I saw the 1989 Batman film was, I walked out of the theater thinking that was great, but I wish I'd seen more Batman.
Yeah.
I wish I'd seen more Michael Keaton in the Batman suit. And I think that was a takeaway for a lot of people. And you're right. I mean, you saw a lot of the Phantom. You saw a lot of Kit Walker in the suit in daylight. He was actually like you could actually see him. He wasn't this shadowy figure in the dark recesses of the jungle. He was like. He was full on, and it was bright purple.
Yeah,
and, not the most earthy tone when you're running around the jungle or riding a white horse in the jungle. It just bright purple just doesn't. You don't equate that with a jungle Avenger, but there he was.
Yeah, that's one of those weird choices they made back in those days. And it's funny when I was watching it last night, and I'm thinking as I'm watching the movie, I'm like, this costume looks pretty damn good for what they're doing. I mean, credit to them for going full. If it had been a different color, I think it would have been a different story. But I think the fact that it is such a dark color, it helps it work a little bit better. But it was funny. I'm watching it, and my wife walks by, and she sees the TV, and she's like, "That looks ridiculous."
It's funny. She must know my wife, because my wife said the same thing. Because she watched it with me several years ago, and she just said, I can't connect to this purple suit. And but but that aside, I think you're right. I mean, I think it helped that, like, there's a couple scenes where Billy Zane has his shirt off. The guy's incredibly ripped in this movie, so
Mhm.
and he fills out the suit pretty well. But yeah, it's true to the original design,
Mhm.
minus the striped trunks.
Yeah.
And like I say, Zane's in great shape, so he pulls it off. He makes it believable, for
Yeah.
sure.
And
Yeah.
you're talking about his build. He had spent a good year just like working
Is that
out
right?
nonstop. Yeah, and
Wow.
because the
Yeah.
original suit they had made had like molded muscles. It was more like in the
Hmm.
vein of like the Batman suit.
Right. Right.
And then by the time filming it started, Zane just didn't need it because he was
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
so buff.
Right. 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 Yeah.
And also real credit to Zane is that he had become a big fan of the Phantom when he was working on Dead Calm in 1989. And
Okay.
when he was on the set there, someone had introduced him to the Phantom comic strips, and he just devoured them, and he became a huge fan. And so when he got this role, he just worked nonstop, not only physically, not only lifting weights and all that and working out, but also just rereading the comic strips over and over again, trying his best to kind of nail the kind of mannerisms and the characterization that Falk was going for in the
Right.
comics.
Right. And I think he was successful at it.
Yeah.
I mean, we could talk a lot about the subtleties of some of the dialogue and some of the interaction between characters, but I think by and large, I think he dialed in pretty well to what the Phantom was about. He seemed very much at home in the jungle setting, which you wouldn't. I mean, a lot of people think of the Phantom as like Tarzan in a purple suit,
Mhm.
but I mean, he does come off believable in that sort of very exotic setting.
And I think when you're talking about the kind of dialogue and stuff, that's one of the failings of this movie, and it's
I agree.
because when it was in the original development stages, Joe Dante was going to be directing it,
Okay.
and Jeffrey Boehm was still the writer, and they had worked together, and their actual original intent was to do it as a spoof. Um,
Okay.
and a lot of those elements still remained in the script after
Yes.
Dante left the project, even though
Yes.
and Simon Windsor, to his credit, is a fan of the comics, so he tried to bring it back, make it more, take a more serious approach to it. But there's a
Hmm.
lot of that kind of tongue-in-cheek stuff and I think what stops it from going full into that territory, like I think the Shadow did,
Hmm.
is I think has a lot to do with Billy Zane. I think he
I
really
agree.
dials
I
it
agree.
back, and he really kind of injects that kind of realism and that kind of earnestness into
The
the.
funny thing is, like you, I just went back and watched it again the other night, and I saw a lot more of that. I don't want to say silliness. That's not a fair characterization. But I saw a lot more of that tongue in cheek aspect
Mhm.
than I remember from the first time I saw it in a theater back in the day, and even subsequent times that I saw it a few years after that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. You get some distance from it, you go back and look at it, and especially in the context of what we've seen to come out of Marvel Studios in the last 10 or 12
Mhm.
years, it's like, oh, okay, this, you know, it changes your perspective somewhat, and you start to see what was going on that maybe you didn't see, 25 years ago when we were all a hell of a lot younger.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think also one of the things I kind of liked about it, and it's funny you mentioned the MCU because that was on my mind too when I was watching this movie, and I was thinking in some ways this could be seen kind of as a prototype movie for the MCU,
Yes. Hmm.
because a lot of the MCU films they do have that kind of they keep it grounded and well as grounded as you can be when you're dealing with magic rocks and everything like that, but
Sure. Sure.
but they keep the characters are grounded, are mostly realistic, but they do have these
Yes.
tongue-in-cheek aspects, and I think the way Billy Zane plays the Phantom is very much in that vein, especially when you
Yeah.
compare it to like Michael Keaton, obviously very very grimly serious portrayal
Yes.
of Bruce Wayne,
Billy Zane
Batman.
actually smiles a number of times in that
Yeah,
suit.
yeah.
Yeah.
In
Hmm.
fact, I think this is the only time I think anyone had really kind of had this kind of combination of earnestness with tongue in cheek was probably Christopher Reeve.
Yes. Yeah, and he kind of wrote the book. I mean, that guy.
Yeah.
With each passing year since he's been gone, and since that franchise, kind of ended many years ago, I go back and I look at him, especially in that first Superman movie. I think this guy really worked at it, and this guy really nailed every aspect of this character, both as Superman, as Clark Kent. That I mean, he kind of set the standard, and for as dated as that movie might seem, 40 some years later, 43 years later, there. I think people still look at him as like, this is the guy who set the standard for at least the next 20 years of, or 30 years of movies like this, of that nature, of that genre.
Absolutely. Yeah. I definitely co-sign that. And we covered that, the Superman, the movie, back in our first episode with Derek. And one of the things I remember talking about in that movie is the scene where he says, where he's being interviewed by Lois, and this is kind of a digression, folks, I know, but I wanted to touch on this. But there's that line when he says, I'm here to fight for truth, justice, and the American way. And Lois just kind of laughs at him, but he plays it completely serious. You're like, you believe he's being earnest in that scene. He's not delivering that line in a tongue-in-cheek way.
Right. If you're gonna put on that suit or any suit of that kind, and play that kind of a role, you really have to, you as the actor or actress have to buy that character. You really have to, because you can't sell it if you yourself don't buy it first. And he did both very well. He bought into it completely, and he sold it completely.
That was, I think, one of the failings of The Shadow, and also some other superhero adaptations. Later seasons of Smallville definitely come to mind, is the winking, the constant winking at the audience, like you know what we're doing, but Billy Zane has none of that, right? He's just completely earnest. He's and he's got this charm about him. I think Billy Zane was acting in the wrong decade. I think he should have been in superhero movies now. Like, this guy definitely has that kind of MCU quality. And so much so that he could go either way. Like, I mean, you see him, because he had shaved his head for this role to put the mask on, because the mask wouldn't fit over his hair. Right. So all the scenes when he's unmasked, those were filmed initially, and then later on, all the scenes with him in the mask, he had his shaved head. And you look at him with his charm and with the bald head, and he could have easily played a really convincing Lex Luthor too.
Absolutely, yeah. Especially now as he's a significantly older man. I mean, I think I think you're absolutely right. He just he has that presence about him. He has that sort of chiseled look about him, and I think there's a lot more he could have done in that genre if, as you said, he had come along at a slightly different time.
Yeah.
You mentioned something a minute ago about how I don't remember exactly how you said it. It's very much, this movie is very much grounded in the real world. There's something going on in this film that I think we've gotten kind of spoiled by the MCU, and I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. I mean, we've come to really appreciate, and we've come to expect really highly, carefully, artistically choreographed action scenes. And it's great. It's great to watch. I love that stuff. But this movie, it's like down and dirty. I mean, some of the fighting, some of the action, it's kind of clumsy. And if you think about it, that's kind of how that kind of action would take place in real life. If you're duking it out with somebody, you're not. It's not. There's nothing really finessed about it. People are getting bloody and they're tumbling over each other, and you see some of that in this movie, which makes it kind of more real. It's less ballet, and it's more just like gritty boxing or MMA. It's just hard work, and I think it's to the credit of this movie.
Yeah, I think I was thinking the same thing when I was watching it last night. Excuse me. And watching it last night, I was thinking that the action looks pretty damn good for 1996, especially when you compare it to some of the bigger productions that were being done at the time, and where they tried to do too much with despite what little they had access to. And I think Simon Windsor deserves credit for that. He seemed to understand what limitations he had and made sure he worked within those. And it really shows that you can make a decent superhero movie that looks good, even if you don't have Disney money.
Well, there was no wire work to speak of, because you couldn't digitally erase that stuff, because that technology didn't exist.
Right. So I mean, this movie had a budget of $45 million. That's like, as Derek would often say, that's like, that wouldn't cover the catering budget on the MCU films.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It just, the technology wasn't there to make the stylized movies that we see today. But in spite of that, they came up with a pretty damn good movie in terms of visual effects and stunt work and choreography.
They also have some pretty surprising names in this movie too. One of the things that
Yes.
always surprised me every time when I sit down and watch this movie, is seeing Catherine Zeta-Jones in it.
Yes.
Because I always forget that she was in this movie, and then I watch again, I'm like, oh my god, that's Catherine Zeta-Jones.
Yes. Well, I think, you're a good bit younger than I am. No one had really ever seen her before this movie. I won't say this was her screen debut, because it was not. But she hadn't done much in 1996. She had done a few things, but this was a pretty early role for her. She had done some film and television prior to this. Not a whole lot, at least not much that was memorable. She was only she was in The Mask of Zorro 2 years later, and that was when things really started to happen for her. That was a very high profile role in a high profile movie, and that's when her career took off. But
sorry, which one was that you said?
The Mask of Zorro.
Okay, yeah, that's
in 1998.
Yeah.
Which is just 2 years after this one. But I think when she showed up, she takes off the aviator mask in the Phantom, and this gorgeous brunette. I don't think anybody really had seen much of her at all prior to that, and so that was. I won't say this movie was her launching point, but she was right on the cusp. I think it's fair to say that Mask of Zorro was her real launching point. But
I was going to say the same thing. And it's funny that both of it, these two pulp movies are really what kind of launched her career. Because up until this, she was kind of being typecast as the token pretty girl in a lot of British films. So that's one of the reasons why she had moved to LA. And then she had done The Phantom, and then she had done a CBS miniseries about Titanic, and that's when Spielberg saw her, and that's when he put her in Mask of Zorro. And that was a really great move, because I think she, just as much as Billy Zane, she does the best job of kind of capturing that earnestness mixed with that big of tongue-in-cheek aspect. And I find myself watching her in this movie and I wish she was the main villain than as opposed to Treat Williams.
We could talk quite a bit about Treat Williams and how he interpreted this character, but I agree. I think she was much more interesting in the villainous role. And I don't say that as a guy for the obvious reasons. Yes, certainly she was nice to look at, but I think she brought a lot more depth. There was something more interesting about her, especially when she starts to turn a little bit towards maybe the third quarter of the film, where you get the sense that she's having some misgivings about this thing she's involved in, and she's starting to ally herself with the Diana what's her Christy Swanson character.
Diana.
I'm going to get
Palmer.
it right. Thank you, Diana Palmer. Yes. You see her at some point. She's realizing, wait a minute, maybe I'm into this thing too deep, and I need to redeem myself by just allying myself with this other female character, and maybe we can get out of this without completely, just compromising ourselves. And which was an interesting kind of character twist there that you kind of didn't see coming the first time you saw it.
Yeah. And they had a little hint at that, which one of the things I did like about that is that little hint of, not necessarily with her character, but with people around Xander Drax kind of looking at this guy like, maybe this guy stop playing with the full deck. Was when he's meeting with all those mob bosses, and one of them is just like, what the hell is this? I was an altar boy. What are we doing?
Yeah. It's funny because I always, just watching this movie again the other night, I'm thinking Treat Williams is doing like a poor man's knockoff of Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor. Just sort of like over the top bravado, enormously egotistical to the point of narcissism. Like, am I not the smartest, most intelligent, most fascinating, and just it. But it worked for Gene Hackman because Gene Hackman was Gene Hackman.
Exactly.
I just don't, and I felt like Treat Williams was kind of riffing on that whole idea of just sort of maniacal and narcissistic, and it kind of didn't work for me.
Yeah, if you're gonna do Gene Hackman, you better be Gene Hackman.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And also there's probably a little bit of Jack Nicholson Joker in there as well, and also same principle, which I think Christian Slater learned the hard way. If you're going to do Jack Nicholson, you better be Jack Nicholson.
Right. Exactly.
And yeah, watching Treat Williams in this movie, it's just like there is no piece of scenery that he's not gnawing on throughout.
Oh yeah, well, and it feels like by the middle of the movie, it feels like he's not even like he's sort of like his dialogue. He's just it sounds like he's shouting every line of dialogue from the top of a mountain, like And now I'm going to say this, and now I'm going to say that, and it just there was almost like a lockstep cadence to it, like you don't even hear the words anymore. It's just Treat Williams reciting the next line of dialogue, and it became very not believable for me by about the middle of the film.
It stands out so much when you compare it to how Catherine Zeta-Jones delivers, very similarly cheesy lines, like when they first kidnapped Diana, and Sala has this thing where she says, he's in love with you, and you're in love with him, and all that. It sounds so cheesy and so childish, but somehow Zeta-Jones makes it work in that scene. She's the only one who can deliver that line and make it not sound ridiculous.
Even when she starts asking Diana Palmer about her boots and where she got them, there's something for his comical, and I don't want to say comical, but for his tongue-in-cheek as that is, it's like you could almost, here's two attractive women in a room comparing clothes and where they got them. Never mind that one's a villain and one's sort of the damsel in distress. It's sort of like okay, they're admiring each other's clothes. So.
And it's also a real contrast when you see how Zeta-Jones plays the role, which is compared to how Christy Swanson plays the role of Diana Palmer, or as I call her, the terrible Buffy. She's
trying to be I felt like she was trying too hard to be feisty. And it was just too heavy-handed. It just like, okay, we get it, you're feisty. Now just get back to being the character and stop trying to show us how feisty you are.
And just some of her dialogue is just cringy. Like, I don't know. I mean, granted, they're not giving her a lot to work with, still, like, Zane and Zeta-Jones were given the same terrible lines to work with, and they somehow made them work. But she just could not, like, when she's like, do you know how many laws you've broken? I'm just like, it just sounds ridiculous.
Yeah. It's like he's a vigilante. That's what vigilantes do. They break laws all the time.
Yeah. So she, and in fact, I found myself wishing as I'm watching this movie that they had just kind of combined. They had just gotten rid of Christy Swanson and Treat Williams and just made Sala the love interest / antagonist in this movie. I think I would have enjoyed it a lot better.
Sure. I mean, it worked in the Flash Gordon story where I am not as familiar with it, but at some point Flash Gordon becomes like sort of quasi romantically involved with Ming the Merciless's daughter, and there's sort of this sort of romantic sexual tension that goes on between the two, which makes for a really fascinating story, which would have worked here, I think, to your point.
I think so too.
Yeah, it would have made it
especially when you get to the third act and you have Kari Hiroyuki Tagawa as Kabai Singh, and he's Tagawa is great in these types of roles, like in Mortal Kombat or in this, and just like he's got that, just like Zane and Zeta-Jones. I think he's got that. He toes that line between not being too over the top, but just being theatrical enough.
There's this wild-eyed thing that he does. Even all the dialogue aside, the stuff that he does with his face is just kind of fascinating.
Yeah. And for years, I had looked at this guy and I'd say if they were ever going to do the Mandarin in live action, they should look at how Tagawa plays these types of characters.
That's funny. I think I thought the same thing when I watched it the other night. I thought this guy, if someone was going to be bold enough to actually cast an Asian in the Mandarin role, this could be the guy.
Well, we did eventually get it, but a very different version of the Mandarin.
Right,
in Shang-Chi.
Right.
But yeah, he was, and I love it every time he turns up in a movie like this, because you don't expect him, and then all of a sudden he just pops up on the ship. It's like, oh crap, there's Tagawa.
Right. Yeah.
Also, I think James Remar was also in this too, and he's had James Remar is an interesting actor because he should have had a much better career than he's had.
I'm not. I mean, I'm not as familiar with his career. I was aware of him. Well, let's say when I first saw the movie way back, I was not familiar with the guy. I have since become more, but I can't say I've tracked his career a whole lot.
Because he's been in a lot of, mostly like for a long time, he was just like kind of like this B movie actor. Like he was they brought him in to replace Christopher Lambert on the second Mortal Kombat movie when Christopher Lambert decided that movie was beneath him. And and he had done like a lot of voiceover work. He had done like these little bit parts, and I don't think anyone really kind of gave him credit for what he could do until he popped up in Dexter. And I think that's really what changed people's opinions of him. And watching him in this movie, you can kind of see those early hints of what he'd be capable of later on.
Well, he's in this movie, he's of all the henchmen, and granted, he's sort of the lead henchman among Drax's, crew. He's the one who's like the most believable. He's the least goofy. The rest are kind of like clumsy idiots. But I mean, there's a line, and I can't remember. There's a lot of guns in this movie. There's a lot of gunfights in this movie, and I don't know. I don't know if this was an idea of either the screenwriters or the director, but I don't know if you noticed, but for as many guns as there are in this movie, everyone seems to be a pretty lousy shot. Until like the Phantom at the end starts like taking people out in that sort of that underground lagoon thing. But there's a line, and I don't remember which gunfight it was because there are many, where like his pals are shooting at whoever they're shooting at, and no one's hitting the mark. And Remar says, "What's the matter with you guys? Can't you hit anything?" And I'm thinking, is that sort of like the director or the screenwriters apologizing for all the missed rounds that don't really hit the mark? Because it just seems like it's like, I'm glad you noticed that too, because I've been watching that for the last 20 minutes and no one's hitting anything here. But
kind of reminds me of in the Batman 66 movie when they've got Batman captured, and then the Riddler's just like, why don't we just kill him and just get over with? And everyone else like, no, we gotta have this big elect. Riddler's like, just fucking kill the guy. And I felt like that was Frank Gorshin just stating the obvious out of character.
If we do that, it'll only be a 20-minute movie. Right.
So yeah, he was pretty good. And again, I think if you had elevated his role and gotten rid of Treat Williams, this would have had been a much stronger movie.
Yes.
And then also, I was kind of surprised because I'm watching the guy who plays, Kit's father, the previous Phantom, and I'm watching like, oh man, I know that guy. And then looking at the cast list, it's like Patrick McGoohan, the prisoner. I'm like, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And he's another actor who, he brings this more kind of like sophistication or kind of like prestige to this kind of movie.
I had read somewhere recently, probably since I watched the movie again, he at one point was being considered for James Bond. I don't know where in the history of the franchise that was, but at one point he was being considered for James Bond. He was also being considered for the Simon Templar role as the Saint, either before or after Roger Moore. I don't know, but he was on the short list for some pretty iconic British figures, British fictional heroes. For whatever reason, they just didn't pull the trigger on that. But yeah,
and he was also in Danger Man as well, so it would have made total sense for him to have been in the running. Oh, it says here that he had actually turned it down.
Oh, is that right?
Okay. Yeah. So I'm looking up, found this this article right here, and apparently before Sean Connery.
For moral, I think he was like a pretty staunch Catholic, I think, and
he said that there was too much emphasis on sex and violence.
Yes, I do remember reading that. Yeah. So he
had turned it down, which and you look at him in The Prisoner, and he's basically James Bond. So
that's a big, meaty, high profile role to just say no thank you to. But
And also interesting enough about the Phantom is Sergio Leone was actually interested in the property at one point too.
Interesting.
And you can imagine, like, the dream projects that never were. I think Sergio Leone's Phantom would definitely be up there.
Yeah. The producers of this film, Alan Ladd Jr. and Robert Evans, those are like were some pretty high-powered producers in Hollywood for like several decades each. And I guess I was kind of surprised to see that, because I wouldn't associate those two producers with a movie like this. I would almost think that, like, those two guys would almost consider a movie like that of this genre to be beneath them in some way.
Yeah. And also you had just looking up a few. Joel Schumacher had also been considered for directing as well, which would have been interesting to see how he would have approached something like this, because I think Joel Schumacher gets too unfairly judged for his Batman stuff when he was a much better director than that.
Right. Let me back up a second to you. You mentioned Patrick McGoohan and as Kit Walker's father. The thing I could never figure out in this story is, at several points along the way, Kit is quote unquote talking to or having conversations with his deceased father, and it's never clear to me, and I don't know if it's clear to anybody, is the elder Kit Walker, or is the elder Phantom actually like visiting him as an actual spirit, or is this just sort of like some kind of internal monologue that many of us have with a parent who is gone, and I couldn't quite figure that out. Did you get a sense of what that was? That was never really made clear, because there's a point where he's in the back of a taxi cab,
right,
and he turns to the empty back seat and says, "Well, Dad, here's what's going on," and the cabbie guy named Al, he's looking in the rearview mirror, and he's like, "Well, who are you talking to?" And I guess I'm kind of asking the same question as I'm watching the movie. Who exactly is he talking to? The memory of his father? Is his father actually visiting him from the great beyond, or what's going on there?
Yeah,
and I wonder what you thought of that.
I think the movie was trying to make the case that he was talking to the ghost of his father, like kind of a Black Panther type of thing, with when he that kind of gives it the quasi mystical thing when you think about the ring and all that, and with the skull. So I think that was kind of what was hinted at there. And especially because in that scene in the cab you're talking about, his father gives him some new information. When he asks, why does Quill have your belt? And he says, and he tells him the story of how he died. And so that, I think, gives you a hint that I think that's the clearest hint that it is actually the ghost of his father. But I don't know. I personally kind of like it where it's unknown and it's not clear, because I do kind of like the idea that, living in the jungle and, being immersed in the legends of the past and all that has made Kid a little off, and he's actually just imagining his father's there.
Right. I guess, I mean,
because even so, because when his when Garan comes in and says, "Who are you talking to?" and he says, "Oh, nobody."
Right. Talking to myself. I think he said, yeah.
So you think if this was a real thing, if his, the guy who's serving the Phantom would be someone who could know about it. But I think the fact that he doesn't. So I think the movie does both those things to kind of leave it open to interpretation.
Yeah. I think you're right. It kind of, and again, the other night was not the first time I've seen it, obviously, but just, I really started to think about it. Like, who exactly is he talking to? Is he just talking to a memory, or is he talking to an actual spirit that visits him on a regular basis? And you're suggesting that maybe it's intentionally unclear, and it should sort of stay that way, just to to sort of to accentuate the mystical element of the jungle.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can make an argument either way. You can make a case for either one, I think.
Sure.
But yeah, I think anything else you wanted to mention about this movie? I think we kind of covered most of the things I wanted to talk about.
As I recall, and I did a little reading recently, but I remember the critics were all over the place with this movie. As I recall, it did not do well in the box office. I saw it in an empty theater. Yeah. And I don't know, and it was I think it had only been out for a few weeks, and the theaters were already empty. I was the only person in this. It was one of the smaller cement bunkers, but
talking about, box office, as you mentioned, it was $45 million budget, but the worldwide gross was just over 17 million. So it did not even make back its own money.
Right. And I guess, it's just, I guess my takeaway is, it's an underrated film. It's not perfect. It has its flaws, and I think we've pointed out a few, and maybe there's a few we haven't pointed out. It is not without its flaws, but for what it was in the time that it was made, it was pretty ambitious. It was pretty true to the source material. It was pretty entertaining in an Indiana Jones kind of way. I think it deserved a little bit better than what it got.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think part of the problem is the time period it came out in, because when comic book stuff was coming out back in this time period, it was not treated seriously. Like if you look at, like, I've been, Lois and Clark recently came back onto HBO Max, so I thought I'd go back and try and rewatch some of those episodes. And you talk about not aging well. That show has not aged well. Like, it is excessively cheesy. And you look at something like The Shadow too, which it's got that same kind of energy to it. The Rocketeer and the Phantom, though, they don't. They're much more serious. And I think The Rocketeer plays it pretty much straight throughout, which is why it is, it still has this cult following. And The Phantom is operating in this weird middle ground where half the people are playing it straight and half the people think they're doing a parody. Right. And that doesn't work because not everyone's on the same page. Right. Yeah. It's a similar problem I had with Punisher Warzone, which we covered a few episodes ago, where you had, Ray Stevenson, playing the Punisher, very straight, very gritty, very hard nosed. And then you got, I can't remember the guy who's playing Jigsaw, but you got him and his brother who were just like acting like they're in a Batman 66 episode. Right. And it's just that disconnect does not work at all in this movie. Well, I would go so far as to say is that some of that was going on in the Batman '89 movie, and it didn't necessarily, for as much as I like that movie, and as much as a lot of people like that movie, it didn't necessarily do the movie a whole lot of many favor. I mean, I think everyone says Jack Nicholson was just brilliant in that movie, and I think for the most part he was. But I think there was a moment at which he stepped over the line from sinister to just sort of absurd or silly, and I think he kind of lost me at that moment. It's still a great movie. Don't get me wrong, but I think just out of curiosity, which moment do you think that was? Is there a specific moment in the movie you're thinking of? I'm thinking. I'm seeing a bunch of scenes in my head. I don't have the sequence right. I think when he shows up at Vicky Vale's apartment. Oh, okay. I think that's when things just get too like goofy for me. Like the things he's saying, and well, we could do a whole episode on the dialogue of that movie because there's so many pieces of dialogue in that movie that just make absolutely no sense to me. Like Nicholson was just improvising, or maybe Nicholson and Burton were sort of just like coming up with stuff on the fly. I don't know, but there are so many times when I both when I first saw it and to this day I kind of go, wait, what the hell did that mean? What was he saying there? Like when he yells to his attendant, we're going to ship him out a whole new door. What does that mean? I mean, and there are many moments like that in the movie where it's just sort of like it's, you can almost hear Tim Burton saying, okay, Jack, just say something, just say whatever. And I think there are a few too many moments like that in that movie. I mean, I may be like burned at the stake as a heretic because I know that's considered a classic, and I think it's a great film, but I think there are moments where it needed to tighten up in terms of like like we said before, getting everyone on the same page and deciding, okay, are we doing this straight? Are we doing this tongue in cheek? I think there were a few moments where they needed to do more of that, or Burton needed to do more of that to just make it more streamlined and a little bit more direct. I mean, those are fair points, and I think you get a lot of leeway when you're playing the Joker just because of the nature of that character. Because you're the Joker. Exactly. Right? Sure. Yeah. Right. So I think that they can get away with a little bit of that. But you are right. If you look at some of I think Batman Forever is probably another good example of this, where you've got the villains acting like they're in, Batman 66, but then you've got, Val Kilmer and Michael Gough trying to play it straight in the midst
Right.
of all this.
Right. Exactly.
And then you get Chris O'Donnell acting like, a 40-year-old petulant child.
Right. Right. Whose career, by the way, has gone pretty much nowhere as far as I can tell. But yeah.
It is interesting because he was up for that role against Leonardo DiCaprio, and looking at how those two paths diverged in the woods.
I can't say I'm all terribly fond of Leo DiCaprio either as an actor
really?
in general. But no, I often look at him in whatever movie he's in, and I just say I don't quite get it. I don't see what the appeal of this guy has been for so long. I mean, you talk about a petulant 40-year-old. That's about all I see when I see Leo DiCaprio on the screen. It just 40 going on 15. Like, I don't know. For whatever reason, he just it's just a personal thing. He just never did it for me.
And so going back to talking about the Phantom,
yes.
It apparently has gone. It did have decent sales on video and DVD after the fact. And yeah, you're right. The critical responses were pretty mixed. I mean, it's got a 43% rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yes.
Ebert seemed to like it. He said it was one of the best looking movies in a long time. And
that surprised me. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I remember. Do you remember? Well, you might not remember the show Siskel and Ebert at the movies. It was basically like a half-hour syndicated show.
I never watched it, but I remember it being on the air. Yeah.
I remember watching them review that movie. And Roger Ebert seemed to pretty much dislike every movie he ever saw in his life because he was often very curmudgeonly about his take on just about any movie. I remember it surprised me at the time. And again, 1996, I'm only in my mid 20s, and I'm watching. He's like, wow, he actually likes this movie. This is like. And it wasn't the kind of movie I would expect Roger Ebert to like, but he apparently did. I remember watching that segment of him reviewing that movie, and the snippet you just read. It's true. He for whatever reason it was the thumbs up for him.
Yeah, and other people, they really liked the kind of nostalgic tone about it, but
yes,
but yeah, it just did not quite hit that right mark for whatever it was with audiences. And they had actually originally planned to do 2 sequels. Like, this was actually intended to be the first part of a trilogy. And Billy Zane was signed on to do all 3, but those plans got scrapped after sales.
Sure. You can tell just by the way the film is crafted that was the plan. I mean, a lot was like, the ending wasn't really much of an ending at all. It was more like, stay tuned, or tune in tomorrow, or tune in next year, or whatever, because there's more we can do with this guy.
Especially because in as late as 2008, Paramount Pictures was still thinking about doing a sequel with Zane and Swanson and Zeta Jones all coming back.
That's like
12 years later. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But then, so kind of doing what they've done with other franchises lately, like with Rocky, Terminator, and all those sorts of things. But then they had scrapped those plans, and then they had tried to do a reboot called The Phantom Legacy, and Sam Worthington was being thought of as the lead for that. Okay. But then by 2014, all those plans had fallen completely through, and that's the most recent thing with Mark Gordon as producer attached to a reboot. And then, of course, there was also the Phantom TV series in.
Yes.
Okay, so I think you've seen that, so you could probably give some comments on that.
I don't. I have. I'm aware of it. I haven't. Yeah, I really couldn't. I'm aware that there was a series. I did not. There was a whole section of my life where I was watching like zero television. But was that animated, or was that?
There was an animated show too. There was an animated show, I think, in the late 90s, early 2000s, called The Phantom 2040.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember I was aware of that. But again, I mean, that late 90s, early 2000s, I was like, I don't think I even owned a TV for several years. So yeah.
Oh no, that was late 90s. That was it was from mid 90s, 94 to 96.
Okay.
So that actually predated the movie, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Okay.
Because I don't think I had ever heard of that show until after the cartoon. After the movie, I mean.
Okay.
And it involved Peter Chung, who had done Eon Flux, and apparently the show had gotten really positive reviews. So that's interesting. I'd never known it was that well received. So
I'm
might be-
assuming from the title that it took place in the future, correct?
yeah. It says, and the central character is said to be the 24th Phantom.
Okay. The reason I asked the question is because, and granted, I freely admit I am a sucker for this period, the 1930s through the World War II era. I always wonder how realistic is it to think that you can take a character that's rooted in that period and completely pull him out of that and put him that far in the future. And I don't know what the answer is, but I just it's a risky enterprise, I think.
I mean, I'd never seen this show, even though I was a kid back then. I'd never watched it for whatever reason. I don't know. It was syndicated, so maybe that's why. Maybe it just wasn't on any of the networks I was watching regularly.
Yeah.
But it had some pretty interesting, like, Margot Kidder and Ron Perlman did voice work for it with
Really?
Mark Hamill as well.
Okay.
I'm trying to see where Lee Ramini had done some voice work on this too. Yeah. Okay. Margot Kidder had done the series villain, Rebecca Madison, chairperson of Maximum Inc. And Ron Perlman had played a cyborg character.
Interesting.
So yeah, I'm gonna have to try to look this up now because it seems to be set in like a post-apocalyptic, very late stage capitalist type world, because it says that the story, it's the year 2040, all environmental disasters and the economic resource wars from the early 21st century have decimated the fragile ecosystem balance of an Earth once teeming with life. Everywhere, the privilege and wealthy continue to thrive in expensive real estate developments that tower above the suffering masses. The victims of Earth's misfortune have been forced to subsist on scavenged refuge from the past on the mangled streets of forlorn city-states.
So again, I mean, we're talking about a character whose backstory is deeply rooted in the jungle. And I don't know, can you make that work in the setting you're talking, the setting you just described? I don't know. I'm not saying you can or can't, but you're taking it pretty far afield from its basic roots and its basic source. But I'd be curious to see what if I'm not mistaken, I think I have seen it available on Amazon on disc or Blu-ray or both. It'd probably be worth checking out at least.
Yeah, because I'd never thought much about it, but I'd never heard much about it. But after reading the positive reviews that it's gotten and the premise, I'm much more curious about it now.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Phantom, they had done a TV miniseries in, what was this? This was 2009 is when they did this miniseries. And I mean, they'd like completely redesigned the costume and made it look like almost like paramilitary-esque, I think is the best way to describe it.
Of course, big surprise, right?
And it's weird when you look at something like this and you think about how they're trying to make it more grounded and realistic, and they only end up making it look ridiculous.
Yeah, it feels like that's the go-to half the time. It's just like, let's put armor on this guy, and it always seems like that's the go-to anymore. Let's give him a suit of armor and I always wonder why is that necessarily considered an improvement? I don't know.
I mean, I think it depends on the character a lot, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, but and granted, I mean, you're talking about a jungle hero who's running around in purple spandex, so it doesn't quite work to begin with.
What do we know?
Yeah.
You're right.
But yeah, it just looks bad. Like I'm looking at the DVD cover right now, and it looks really cheap. And apparently the show had not done well, so that says a lot about it.
And you're talking about a character who, I joked before about Tarzan in a purple suit, but I mean, you're talking about a character who is supposed to be very physically limber, graceful, can move through the jungle, in a very natural setting. If you slap armor on that guy, I think you kind of lose that sensibility pretty quickly.
Yeah. Okay. John, any other things you wanted to mention about the Phantom before we close up?
I don't think so. Like I said, it was fun to go back and watch it again. I think we've come a long way in telling that kind of story and making that kind of movie. Technology has allowed that, and I think, but I think you can't have what we have now without going back and without having movies like that to sort of pave the way. I mean, and I think you sort of said that at the outset of this conversation. You can't get to where we are now without, making some movies that are a little bit more gritty and a little less perfect, and maybe some of the themes are showing, but you got to start somewhere. And I think the Phantom was a very noble effort, even if it didn't do well commercially or with the critics.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's worth it just for seeing Billy Zane in a superhero-esque role.
Right. Sure.
I mean, because it does make you think, kind of what could have been if he had gotten like been able to, because he's a pretty underrated actor in general. I think. I don't think, like, we were talking about James Remar. I don't think he's really quite gotten the due that he's deserved.
Yeah, he always seems like he seems like he's always been like on the verge of really, kind of making a big splash and taking the next big step in his career, but it never quite happened.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Yeah. And you never know, that could change because, Ron Perlman, I don't think really quite got that big break until he did Hellboy. So.
Right. I think Zane's in his 50s now, if I'm not mistaken.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's still possible, still time. Yeah. So
hey, I'm 58, or I'm almost 58. So that's right.
Okay, John. Anything you wanted to promote? Tell people where to find you before we close up.
Well, I will say this. I mentioned Flinch Books when I gave my little introduction. We've been doing it now. Jim Beard and I have been doing it now for about 6 years. Just literally the other day, like I want to say December 1st. We came out with our brand new anthology called Blood on the Blade. Mm-hmm. It is a collection of 10 sword and sorcery stories. Please don't ask me to rattle off all the writers because I couldn't do it off the top of my head. But there's some really fine stories in there. It's a direction we didn't expect to go into, but it just an opportunity presented itself, and we just said, we've got some good writers and good stories. Let's do this, and we've got some great cover art by Mark Wheatley. Early response has been very enthusiastic. We're very excited about it. I did not myself contribute a story. I wrote the introduction, but I did a hell of a lot of editing of all the content, as did Jim. But if you're looking for something new from Flinch, that is literally hot off the presses. I like I said, I think it was December 1st was what we promised to have it out by the end of November, and we missed a mark by like 12 hours. The thing was on. It was available on Amazon. It went up on Amazon like noon on the 1st. So it is now available. Check it out. Blood on the Blade. 10 stories of sword and sorcery. We're very excited about it, and it sounds like a lot of other people are too.
Okay, great, cool. Yeah. All right. Well, John, thanks so much for coming on the show to talk about the Phantom.
Thank you. Nice. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Have you come on again at some point in the future?
Sure, love to.
Thank you. So that does it for this episode of Superhero Cinephiles. Also, just a note to everybody, this is going to be the last episode of the year. I believe when you're listening to this, it's probably right before Christmas when this episode is coming out. So we are going to actually have a little bit of a break until after the new year. I'm going to be in Chicago, actually leaving later this week. I'm recording this on December 5th. And we're coming back after Christmas, but then we have to do 2-week quarantine in Tokyo in a hotel. So then after that, we'll be able to come back. So I won't be back here to actually get into the studio to record any new episodes until about early January. So just be patient with us. I think I'm going to probably schedule some repeat episodes in that time frame too. So you guys got some other stuff to revisit while I'm away. But anyway, thanks for listening. And if you are interested in being on the show, you can drop me a line, superherocinephiles.com. There's a contact form. You can also find ways there to support the show. And we are at Super Cinema Pod on both Twitter and Instagram. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for listening. And we will see you in the new year. You have been listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Super Cinema Pod. Join our Facebook group by searching for Superhero Cinephiles, where you can interact with us and other superhero fans. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a regular supporter at Patreon or make a one-time donation through PayPal, both of which can be found at our website, superherocinephiles.com. If you buy or rent any movies through the Amazon links at our site, it helps support the show. Please be sure to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.